Hello, my name is Connor.
And I'm Jason.
And you're listening to the Amazed and Perplexed podcast. So the question that we have today, hello, by the way, welcome. The question that we have today is, Jason and I really love to focus on the fact that you and I, listener, and Jason and I, everybody who is listening, assuming that there's no like dogs or, something or other.
Involuntary people that are sitting in the car. Sorry.
Yeah, no, but even you, involuntary person, not speaking to the family dog, probably, I think that's fair. We really love to focus on all of us are made in the image of God, and there's some crazy truths that spring out of that. The fact that there are so many characteristics of God woven into what he is calling us to and who he wants us to be. And so that wasn't highlighted as much for, I feel like, most people. So it's something we tend to lean on pretty heavily. But the psalm we're going to talk about today kind of goes in the other direction. Maybe this is going to sound much more familiar to your upbringing, but I think it's really important that we recognize the dual facts that we're made in God's image, yet there is this vast difference between God and us. And so what, Jason, do you think about, like, what's the first thing that pops to your mind when you think about the difference or the gap between you and God?
I think about the awareness of time. I could frame it in the sense of patience or vision, but I am constantly focused on the urgent, the right in front of me, what's the cause and effect of this relatively simple formula. I have an errand. If I don't complete that errand, what's the big cost? Like I was gonna write a letter out to a group of people this morning, and I'm like, I can probably do it tomorrow or never. Like this is, very small, kind of dynamics. Whereas God can and does, but I don't know how he thinks about time because it's out of time. But he thinks of eras. Like he can, and my assumption is he does, based on what I see as he looked at biblical history, is that he's looking. Yes, he's aware of me now and my thoughts now. Simultaneously, he's aware of my thoughts when I'm 80 years old, and the thoughts of my great-grandchildren and how they relate, and the decisions I make today and how they impact or cascade into, influencing what happens there. And that's not me assuming I'm going to impact generations. I'm simply talking about this meticulous and yet carefree, almost casual, how he works through. And I draw that a lot off Jesus, where, I was always talking, there's urgency. You got to tell all these people. And Jesus seems almost to move haphazardly and is kind of, to some people, he'll say, hey, here's what you need to get eternal life. And just side note, he doesn't always tell them the same thing, But then he, it kind of leaves it hanging and, people are everywhere. And just that whole casualness of planning and responding. And it's just such a difference. And I mean, in the best that my mind can do, I understand he's brilliant. And brilliant people think better. They're 5 steps ahead, this kind of thing. But then you say he's also timeless. So he's seeing it all simultaneously. Yeah, that's a huge gap, I guess. What about you? What's that contrast?
I don't see that at all in my. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, I totally echo what you're
we are the same.
So for me, I think about. So for myself, it is really. I have a very vested interest in my life and in myself. I'm pretty important to myself. My wife and my child and my friends and you. That sounds like I'm saying you're not a friend of mine, but
making notes. Go ahead.
But there's this kind of expanding circle where, if we're being 100% honest, I'm most interested in my life than my wife and my daughter, and then it just keeps kind of going out and out and out. Eventually, you get to the people where I want to have an interest in their life. I want to have love and care. I want to have equal love and equal care for my own life, as the same as I do for my wife and for my daughter and for my friends. I don't succeed at that. The thing that is just so alien to me about the nature of God is that he has that vested interest in each one of us. That just seems so unfathomable to me. Because I know, because I'm at the center of my own, life. I know how hard it is, even for people that you love so deeply, to be so all in on them. It is an incredibly hard and everyday sort of work. And to know that God is that way, not just with the people that I love or the people that I tolerate, but the people I hate, or I don't really hate anybody, but the people that I struggle with, that is just so foreign to my way of thinking, into how I live life, and I think to how all of us live life. And so that's a big way it shows up for me.
Yeah, so the psalm we're looking at today is Psalm 24, and I think this encapsulates this. I guess you could say this is David's answer of the contrast as he's presenting it to the world. Beginning of verse 1, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. For he founded it on the seas and established it on the waters. Who may ascend the mountain of the Lord? Who may stand in his holy place? The one who has clean hands and a pure heart, who does not trust in an idol or swear by a false god. They will receive blessing from the Lord and vindication from God their Savior. Such is the generation of those who seek him, who seek your face, God of Jacob. Lift up your heads, you gates. Be lifted up, you ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. Who is this King of glory? The Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. Lift up your heads, you gates. Lift them up, you ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. Who is he, this King of glory? The Lord Almighty. He is the King of glory. So as you take in this song, I'd love to hear it, set to music as they would have, probably a chant, I would suppose. But as you hear this, what amazes you?
So it's just it's in the very first couple verses, and it's a truth. So you hear the truth. Okay, the earth is God's, and you're like, yeah, that's totally true. But to think that God claims all of the earth, and David will then go on to talk about all these ways that God is separate, and all these ways that God is distinct and holy, and just so other than, so good and so right, and for that God to still be interested, and still be like, no, that's still my place. Those are still my people. Those are still where I'm going to show up. That is an incredible truth to me, that I think a lot of times people get this. So when I used to be a youth pastor, anybody who's ever worked in ministry will know it's that weird conversation when you have with a stranger, and that you tell them, oh, I'm a pastor or whatever, I'm a minister, and there's that like they get that look in their face, like they gotta button it up really quick, they've got to get all that,
or unload.
Yes,
usually
unload, or they've got to pretend like they have it all. They've got to either unload or load it back up, and pretend like they've got it all figured out. And there's this fascinating reaction for so many people that when they come into contact with what they perceive to be holy, or what they perceive to be God or representatives of God, it's this idea of well, we have to have this. I'm trying to figure out the right words to put it. We have to have it all. But for God to show up, or if God is going to be in a place, then it has to be all buttoned up. It has to be all figured out. The edges can't be worn, and we have to kind of present this way. And so for me, that truth is just, I don't even think that's necessarily what's probably going on in David's heart when he's writing this. But for me, that is such a profound truth, and that's probably coming a little bit from what my answer was earlier. But yeah, just this profound truth that God is so different, and yet God is so still involved, so here, not afraid of the mess, and that's pretty cool. And then you see that totally. This is why Jesus is so cool, because then you see it personified, you see it embodied in the person of Jesus. So that's what amazes me.
For me, and of course we're in poetry, and I'm not a poetry guy, but trying to think, about and it's like for example, when I'm trying to interpret "Lift up your heads, you gates, you ancient doors," so the King of Glory may come in. My assumption is he's talking to humans, and saying you have access, you have the entryway, but you've got to make a choice. You got to lift up your head. You've got to look to him. That's a figure, he even says in John 8, when I am lifted up and people will look to me, they will be saved.
There's the sense, I think from my reading, there's a sense that it's speaking towards the kind of the people of Jerusalem, that language. And so there's almost this sense of, I think because David is speaking, I think individually, but I think he's also speaking also to a collective sort in a collective sort of way. I could be wrong on that.
Yeah.
Though.
Yeah. And so this just trying to get my finger on what's the conversation really like. But I think the thing that amazes me, jumps out at me is verse 4, because I think the answer is no one. Like if I'm reading this for the very first time and it says, who may stand in God's holy place? The answer is nobody, because they don't have Jesus, And so I guess this could also be filed. I could make it a perplexing point, but I think that it's amazing that my understanding, of course, is that Jesus' sacrifice was that one time for all time, and so as it talks about Abraham in Romans 4, that he was saved by his faith, even though he didn't have access or knowledge of Jesus Christ. Which, of course, once you get to the New Testament, Jesus is very bold of saying, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one gets to the Father except through me." And so, but then you dig into it, the one who has clean hands and a pure heart, who does not trust in idols or swear by a false god. And honestly, this reminds me of Hebrews 11:6, where it talks about, most people know Hebrews 11:1, faith is being certain of what we hope for, what we do not see. But 11:6 is faith is believing that God exists and he rewards those who seek him. And I keep looking for a footnote, and this is for the idiots. Like he's showing all these people of faith, and you're asking yourself the through line, and of course it's faith, but you're watching, okay, this is what faith looks like in all these people, and yet then at 6 he kind of, I don't know, waters it down. He's like, believe in God, and think he's going to reward you. In many ways, it's like almost an egotistical, a self-centered, description of it. So I'm always intrigued when these come up, and so clean hands, pure heart. I'm not suggesting that's not hard. I'm not suggesting that's a struggle. And how pure is the heart? That's really what's the demand here. But the idea of not trusting in an idol or swearing by a false god, I know that was a huge draw. And we're talking about very fundamental things because they didn't have the innovation that we consider commonplace. So if somebody gets sick, it's really about you got to pray to somebody, and if I pray to God and you haven't gotten well and I recognize this person has an idol, then I'm going to turn to it. So I don't want to minimize how hard it is, but it seems almost too simplistic as I guess what it is for me. And I immediately put the impression on this. So I'm even trying to tap in the reason why it doesn't amaze me. It amazes me because of its simplicity, and if I didn't know anything about Jesus, there'd be a part of me like, I can do that. You know what I mean? Which isn't bad or good. It's just that part. I'm surprised.
So here's something that kind of pops into my head when you were talking about that. So I've heard this sort of verses like, who may ascend the mountain of the Lord? Who may stand in the holy place? And you, like you said, there's this easy, like, no one can possibly do it. But what I love, the simplicity of what you're talking about here is it almost becomes more aspirational. Like it almost, the simplicity of it, and the fact that like David then is calling on people and calling on possibly the people of Jerusalem, hey, be this. Like we're calling you to this. We're calling you God is calling you to be these people. So lift your heads up. And so for me, I guess like I really love that reading of it. The idea of not so much of a like a bludgeon of you're not clean, you're not this, but of an uplifting, our call to like, hey, like this is accessible.
Yeah, and I think especially, and it relates to some of what you're saying. When you're ever around somebody and you realize they have power, I'm not around very many people that are like, oh, that's a powerful person, but I've been in the room when the governor was there. I've never spent any time around presidents or anybody like that, but I can get the feel. I mean, even when I was a little kid.
I farted in a room with the governor once. It was
wow,
pretty cool. I was 11 years old. No, I was 12 or 13. I felt pretty special. I'm not gonna lie. It was a small room too. This is just a quick side note. My uncle was he was a state senator, and he was office mates with Mary Fallon.
Okay.
And he died, and they had like a big funeral at the state capitol. And so they had this like room before everybody went in. And I probably had gas station food, and I was like 13 maybe. And I don't think she heard it, but I think probably most people smelled it. So I don't know if that's going to go on the podcast or not. I'll probably text you later in the week and say, should I take this out or not? But sorry.
So it was Mary Fallon that was in the room?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure
Okay,
that timing that timing lines
We
up.
just lost all our non-Oklahomans and most of Oklahomans.
Well, I think there's some Oklahoma. Hey, that's about as currently political as we're ever going to get. So
That's exactly right.
is 2013 politics
Yeah,
and
exactly.
fart humor.
That's how we roll. But that idea of recognizing, oh, this person has power, and then when you realize it's very personal,
Oh, yeah.
you know, to be able to say the earth is the Lord. So then you're like, you start to rethink your ownership and these like and everything in it. Like, oh, so you're suggesting you own me? And let's say you buy in, let's say you believe that, and then you're like, so what do I got to do? You know what I mean? How am I going to make this? Is this person for me, against me? And so hey, keep it clean. And this is the other thing that I think is fascinating. And I'm not suggesting God doesn't say, hey, don't do this and don't do that, because that does come up, especially in the Old Testament. But I do think it's that idea of how you put it's aspirational. It's like, hey, instead of thinking, oh, I'm missing out on sin, you know, which naturally has a draw. But part of that is that psychology of why do you get to participate in it and I don't get to participate in it? But he's like, no, do you see that pollutes you? That makes you dirty. And that idea of, I want to stay clean here.
Yeah, when you sin, I mean, for especially, I'll speak for myself. I'm pretty sure this is a common thing. Like when I sin, I find myself so much more down. I find myself so much more downcast. I find myself so much more like my spirit is down. I feel like my posture changes. I feel like my whole world kind of it just becomes so much more inwardly focused in a angry and judgmental and in a selfish way. And there is this sense of a lot of times we act like the way that we become clean, we become holy is, well, I've got to get really inward so I can clean up the mess inside of myself, when the call of the Bible and the call of God continually is like lift up your head. The solution to clean hands and a pure heart is not, looking down and being able to figure it out neatly together. It's lifting your head up to the King of Heaven. And so, I think that there's so much time. Maybe sometime we'll do a big deep dive on David. And so we'll have to, when David confronts us in heaven about all the mean things that we've said about him in our private studies, we'll have to point to this podcast and be like, we had your back there. We were really in your corner.
We were rooting for you.
So, Jason, what perplexes you in this?
Well, it's the follow-up to that where he's talking about this cause and effect. So the people that keep clean hands and trust God, not a false God, they receive blessing from the Lord and vindication from God, their Savior. And the part that is perplexing, and this is somewhat, it shows up in the Old and New Testament, these kind of cause and effect promises. Hey, you do this, and this is what will happen. In a general sense, I don't have a problem believing, in eternity, this will get made. But it is wearing. I am a very much a believer, way under promise and over deliver. You know, and if I can't over deliver, I feel really bad. Like even though if they're expecting 1 and I give them 2, but I really aspired to give them 4, I feel bad. And just I have to console myself with, well, I only promised 1. But I feel like this kind of cause and effect, it perplexes me why God will come to this when he understands our perspectives are so limited. So I pray for, let's not talk about I pray for $1 million, or I pray never have trouble. I just pray for my wife's health to improve, or I pray for my, parents something, things that aren't evil. And they're, I almost universally praying for someone else, number 1, is a positive, and number 2, for something that's hurting them, especially if you're praying for spiritual things. If you're like, hey, I know they're really discouraged. God, could you really bless them? And then and help them to see you and notice you. and then that doesn't happen. Like there are people I've prayed for years. God, will you provide something? And if it's me, man, I want to be used. I want to be available. And the interactions are not effective. Like there's nothing I sense that, that really moved the dial at all in this person's connection with God. And I see them suffering, because they lack connection. And so it's just perplexing to me. I would disclaim this a lot more. I would say something like, hey, if you pursue this, and maybe that's the key, it's almost like the Sermon on the Mount, or at least how I view it, where Jesus is like, hey, you thought you're doing good not killing? And you're like, yeah, I was feeling pretty. You're wrong. You know what I mean? Because you thought bad thoughts about them in your heart. And is this also part of that setup? It's like the person that says, yeah, I'm going to have a clean heart today, and then or a pure heart today, and you get to the end, you're like, nope, not today, but I'll do it tomorrow. Then after a lifetime, you're like, I need a savior. And that actually makes sense to me. But in its face value and the song nature, which I think they use to really exhort and encourage each other, and that exhort, that means challenge. And I know you know that, Connor, but just not to use two Bible words. But that idea of really trying to make an impact on the people that hear this, to keep moving, keep doing this. This would become a really discouraging lyric to me if I was singing this. And heck, the people are taken into Babylon, especially if I as an individual did it, but maybe the nation was a dumpster fire. But here I am in my little corner, and I'm doing it as right as I know how, and still I'm not getting vindicated. Like my enemies are still out there, and they're still doing bad. So it's a perplexing. I would disclaim this.
Yeah,
I would put a little thing down at the bottom with the asterisk. It'd be like, this may not apply in your lifetime. This may not apply. Sure.
So I'm going to present a theory. When we did Psalm 1 and 2, we were really heavily focused on making sure to remind ourselves this is poetry. Right. This is David encountering, like, his encounters with God and his relationship and the processing and that whole thing. You can go back and listen to what we talked about. But I wonder, there's a lot about that we read in the Old Testament, and some specific, and we can talk about it at a later point, where there are things that the Old Testament God doesn't line up with what Jesus is after in the New Testament, and in some specific cases, and I wonder here if this applies. That reminder has been kind of clarifying to me. David, I'm pretty sure when he's thinking about this, he's thinking probably pretty earthly. He's thinking about, hey, I pray this thing happens. I'm holy. This, like, the good things come, and good things happen to David a lot, and he ends up pretty, he's faithful in circumstances, and he ends up pretty powerful, and so why wouldn't he necessarily believe this? I wonder if this is one of those instances where David, and I am completely open to correction, and I'm not saying this for a fact, but I wonder if it's one of those instances where David is writing this, David is singing this, and he means it in one way, but God perseveres it because he sees the deeper meaning. He sees the truer, long-term meaning, like you talked about, of David singing it because life has worked out in a lot of cool ways for him, and so vindication for him, looks like a victory over the enemy. But vindication for God, for David, probably doesn't necessarily look exactly like that, even though that's what David is perceiving, what God is doing in his life. And so I wonder, when we think about those disclaimers, like, is this the natural process of being able to look back on thousands of years of saints and followers of this God, and say, like, is this one of these examples, at least for me, is this one of those examples where we can go, this is a cool way in which God is using a flawed human in a relationship, a flawed human with a relationship with God. Is God using that? Even though the human thinks it's something else, God is using that to communicate different, the same truth, but a deeper truth than what the plain reading would say at the time. So I don't know. What does that sound like? How heretical did I get?
Yeah, no, I think that's very plausible, and I'm just thinking, out loud right now, but I think there's some consistency there between David's expression here, his understanding, his interaction with God, and how Jesus will walk with his disciples, where he will let them think that this is going to be a physical kingdom, that David, Solomon-esque kingdom is what is in Peter and Andrew and James and John's future, and he lets them think that, or you have to assume he's not good at figuring out what they're wanting, but assuming he's tuned in and he has a sense of their hearts, he's not surprised in Acts where they're like, hey, when are you going to restore the kingdom to Israel? Which that should be the furthest things from their mind at that point. But they are still thinking, and it goes to James and John's question, hey, who can be seated on the right and the left? They're still thinking of a human power structure, of a human kingdom, and he knows that in time they'll figure this out. So I think it's a really good observation on a lot of levels, one of which is this is David's perspective. It doesn't make it untrue. It's just, this isn't God speaking and David, this isn't like a prophet where God says this. This is David interacting with God, and this is his song to God. And so, it is, and I would say, are there statements he makes, maybe not necessarily here, but in other places, where it's like, I don't think that really represents fully the heart of God, but that to me is the point of Psalms. In many ways, one of the things it shows us is what is appropriate to talk to God about. Is it only appropriate to talk to God when you're super good Christian and you got it all cleaned up? And well, not according to the Psalms, because there's multiple times where they're despair, super angry. And so I think that this could be, and again, I'm not even suggesting that what he's saying here is false, but it is his perspective.
Yeah. I think it's true. And I think what David is saying here is true. I also think, it starts off the truth that David starts this off with is, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. And I think there's this thought, okay, the earth's, that means this moment on December, whatever it is, 15th at 11:26 on a Wednesday is the Lord's. And I go, okay, well, next minute it'll still be the Lord's. And in this exact moment for David, it was the Lord's. But I think there needs to be this reminder for ourselves that you talked earlier about the timelessness and the way that God perceives our actions and how they affect, the future and how previous things affected us now. There needs to be this recognition that we have this sense. So we read this and we go, okay, why isn't the disclaimer? And for me, I totally echo what you had to say there. But I was realizing while I was thinking, yes, I agree with Jason. I wish there was this disclaimer because I think what David says is true, but it can leave somebody thinking in a way that's ultimately not helpful. There's this assumption for me that is the last time that's going to be thought, that we spent 3,000 years since whatever David was around and it's all culminated, and then now we've got it figured out. The beautiful thing I think about the nature of the whole earth's, all of time and eternity being God's, is these can be really helpful observations for us now, and also recognizing that there could be somebody who stumbles upon our podcast or reads this 100 years from now or 2,000 years from now, and there could be another clarifier or more helpful distinction that they make, and recognizing that doesn't invalidate what we have to say here and now. It's just validating what they had to say now. And us saying, hey, saying this thing about David, it's not us invalidating what David had. It's actually validating the work that God was doing in that moment, and then validating what God is doing in this moment. And I think so. I think that this is, and I don't know how intentional David was with his writing here, but the fact that he starts off this poem, basically saying, like, this is all God's, all time, all eternity, I think is a helpful, it's a helpful reminder thing for me. It's a helpful checkpoint to remind myself that, like, that this isn't the pinnacle of God's creation, where we've come, where we've found ourselves theologically, where we found ourselves in our spiritual growth. We haven't reached the pinnacle of, okay, God was waiting when he was interacting with David, and David wrote this. He wasn't waiting. He wasn't interacting with David in a specific way so that it would all culminate in Connor and Jason having this kind. He knew it would happen. He knew it would be a part of it. But there's still further to go. There's still further to explore, and still places to be. And so that is one of those mind-bending things that I can't even I could talk around for 1,000 years, but I'm not going to be able to approach the vastness and the coolness and the weirdness.
Well, I want to get to what perplexes you. I would throw in this just as a point of consideration. So if I wrote this, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it, and I wrote it right now, I would have a sense of what that means. Yeah, I mean, well, I live in a free country, and why is that? Well, God's allowing that, and I breathe air, and why is that? Well, God provides that, this kind of thing. Well, then if later on today we were invaded by the Canadians, and I think they're the ones that are going to come for us, but we're invaded
always
by
the polite ones.
It's always the polite. But they invade us and they take away we're all in slave camps, and I mean, it's just horrible. And I live the rest of my life in that state and die. And you think, well, now what does it mean the earth is the Lord's and everything in it? Mm-hmm. The Lord that allows me to be a slave the rest of my life. I always think about the Israelites that were taken into slavery, and lived and died in slavery, and like the day later, Moses shows back up and like, I'm taking out of slavery, and I'd be like, well, your timing is the worst. But it is that idea from their perspective. I mean, what a different perspective to the person that was free and then taken into slavery in Egypt, and how the earth is the Lord's. Of course, this was written afterwards, I understand, but that concept, what it would look different if they were in the middle, and what it would look different if they were there at the end. The earth is the Lord's means, we're going to the promised land, and this kind of thing. And just recognizing we always have an evolving, God doesn't change, but we have an evolving view of God.
Yeah.
And I wonder, my sense is David probably wrote this earlier in his life. What would it be like? What was his last psalm? And if he would have said at that time, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, what would that have meant to him?
Yeah, that's good. That's really helpful. So I think that's really good. And vindication to David probably looks a lot different.
Right, especially after his kid die, his daughter gets raped. I mean, all these horrible things happen in his life. What does that look like now?
And the fun part that I think is just, I don't know if we probably won't go down that, but the fun part to think is like, maybe the healthier version is what David is thinking before before all that stuff happens.
Right.
Maybe the closer maybe the closer encounters to God, not the closer encounters to God. Maybe the closer David gets to that ultimate truth comes earlier than it does later, and that I could be wrong.
In a sense, I trust you purely now.
Yes,
and now I've had all these hits, and so it's a different. And I'd be interested, even from our listeners, think about, I don't know again how old you are, but 20% of your life ago, 50% of your life ago, how would you have perceived the statements differently? Like the earth is the Lord's, or any of the statements in the Bible.
Yeah. So what perplexes me is you get this 7 through 10, you get these verses, and David is it seems like David's calling these people, calling the Israelites, calling this culture, calling this way of living to fully invite God in, to lean into the promises, lean into God, lean into what he has for them, to trust in him. And the perplexing thing for me is like when you I think, and this is after my cursory reading of a couple different versions, including the Message and other things, my cursory reading goes, when you begin to put this this calling out there in like modern language, like, like Tulsa, or for you, Memorial Drive Church of Christ, like, man, lift your head up, like, invite the King of Glory, like, you get this refrain that sounds so modern. And one, it's comforting. It is amazing that it's like this call of what God is after with his people isn't changing. But two, it's like, man, this sounds so much more this sound like the perplexing thing is like in 3,000 years, like we're not like we're still on this part. We're still working on, like you talked about earlier, the basics, the simple parts. And I think that just gets to what perplexes me is how it is so. And I recognize the irony in this as two people who have a Jesus podcast, that there seems to be this simple through line of we really let's get back to the trust in God, invite him in, lift your head up to him, and and I do wonder oftentimes, like if God is trying to say to me, his church, his people, like you keep wanting to find the new ways, you keep wanting to find the interesting ways, you keep wanting to do this and that, and like, and I've known you for all, I've known who you would be for all of eternity, and I've known that you would need the simple call to lift your head up for all time. And I knew it because that was the way David was. I knew that because it was the way his people were, and it's the way the people were in Egypt. And it's cool in one way, but it's just perplexing that God is okay with that. That's where I think it's perplexing to me, that God is not, like we talk about all the time, we said earlier, with Jesus and his disciples, when they still don't get it and they still don't understand, like, how is Jesus patient in that moment? I'm wondering now for the first time, is it because God has been doing that? God has been saying that exact same thing to his people for thousands and thousands of years. And the fact that he's not more angry, the fact that he's not more perplexed or upset, or like, let's shift it up a little bit. That's just so mind boggling to me.
I totally track with that. And I think, there's this sense that we, even rejecting like the general sense theory of evolution, if you reject that theory, there is a sense among us that we're evolving, and a lot of it has to do with our technology, because everybody's been to a primitive culture where they were, making their weapons and their tools out of bone and rock and sticks and that kind of thing, and now we look and we're like, man, you can digitally print most of this stuff, and kind of thing, and it's superior, and obviously we have such amazing technology, and I think then we perceive ourselves then as inherently more intelligent and superior to the people that have come before us, and I think it's challenging to not just apply that to all of life. Like our parenting techniques are so much better. Our dietary approaches are so much better. Our whatever, our cultural, what is perceived even as politically correct today, we know it won't be perceived as politically correct in 2 years and 10 years. It'll continue, and there'll always be that assumption that there's always a group of people like, oh, the golden days are behind us. But there is a general humans, oh, we're making progress, or we want to be at least.
The great arc it was the moral arc of the universe or something like that, bending towards justice, I think is the,
yes I've heard that. Did I hear that in a comic book movie? Anyway, so the dynamic though of trusting a God who you can't see and you can't touch, you can't verify in the normal ways you verify reality, that will always be a challenge. And the fact that he may hold your values, some of the values you have, but he holds them in an eternal way, which means, so for example, a child dying, my conviction is a child dying, any child dying, regardless of their family conviction, that child is saved because they never got to the point they can make a choice for, because it's based on your free will of choosing to love God. And so when I hear children dying, I'm super sad for the parents, but for the child's sake, I'm like, this sounds so callous, but good for them. They get to avoid, when my daughter died, I'm like, she never has to have her heart broken, ever. And at the end, she gets just as good as me. Like it's not like she's gonna be like, man, I wish I would have got my driver's license, in heaven, kind of thing. And so, when you really have an eternal perspective, like honestly, I will get thinking eternal, and be talking to somebody that's really hurting, and I've got to be careful not to communicate, because that's such a classic cliche. Is like, well, they're in a better place, so you should feel great, because that's irrelevant where they are. We're talking to the person that's suffering that's not there,
and that's not how that's not how Jesus did it.
Exactly right. Yeah, we've covered that. But it is when you think eternally, and that's just one aspect of God. When you think eternally, you view everything different. So even if he holds the values that we hold, like he values patience and he values long suffering, he values these things, he sees that totally different. And I think that's the part that just recognizing. But you're right. It is perplexing, because you would assume once you get to the fifth book, you're deep into whatever, Deuteronomy, you're all the way into Judges. Now you're really faithful, and recognize, no, we have to be told the exact same thing these people had.
Well, I think it's this funny thing that because we make technological advances, because we can build cooler stuff, that for some reason, I guess we think that our relationships, we think that love We think that, like, we assume that because there's been technological advancement, there's been some new advancement in the technology or the way we love. And there are scientists. There are scientists who believe, going back to what you had said about even if you do believe in evolution, which I tend to lean that way, in a theistic evolution way, but there are scientists who believe that you go about 100,000 years and 200,000 years, I think, and you could take a baby from 100,000 years ago and plop it in modern day America, and it had no problem learning calculus. It had it had normal. It would adapt fine. It would be able to learn completely fine, and change. But there is this thing that we have to remind ourselves, but that those things are like being able to learn calculus and being able to read and being able to do math is cool and it's good, and it's helped us in a lot of different ways. But we all know that our ability to read and do calculus doesn't save us from suffering or struggling with a marriage or struggling with a friendship, or struggling with how to love friends well. And I think this is one of those things that we think we parallel technological advancement with that there's some sort of new love advancement that's been made. And it's just a reminder, I think, that I need to check myself with all the time and go, like, the struggles I may have with my wife or raising my child are a universal struggle that transcend time, language, culture, and so if that's the case, if I can recognize that there are villages right now in the Amazon forest who don't even know that there are other people out there, if I can recognize that, hey, they struggle with family relationships, they struggle with this, they struggle with love, they struggle with that there are these eternal things that pertain to all of us, then it becomes a little less weird for me to think, okay, God is probably not, yeah. So I'm not exactly even sure, but I love that through line of reminding myself, like, there is certain, okay, here's where I'm going to wrap it up and I'm going to finish it up. There are certain advantages that we have today in how we get to relate to God. The fact that we are so, the fact that our society and our culture is so into, I think, into safety, into honoring others' feelings, to embracing needing help. There's 100 different other examples. The call for justice. I mean, there's so many examples that I'm not thinking that would come to my mind later. But we have this tendency to forget there are all these other areas that we're blind to, that an agrarian society would have over us in terms of relating to God. And so I think this is an important thing, and I don't even know how exactly the through line for where we got to your part of the conversation and where I've meandered for the past 5 minutes. But I do think there's an important reminder that there are things that somebody who got to grow up in an agrarian honor shame culture, there are things that they're going to be able to relate to God with that I can't even get to. And there are also good things that I can get to that they couldn't get to. And my work becomes, okay, how do I honor theirs, not shame them for theirs, and not raise mine on a pedestal? So I don't know. There's 1,000 things there. And again, I'm leaving myself with a terrible job to edit. And so I'm sorry, future Connor.
I just want to say the comfort I always find in this, because that can be overwhelming. Like what you're talking about,
yeah,
I see it. It can be so overwhelming.
I think that's why I spent like 10 minutes trying to get there. And if I cut this out, listener, and I just had like a crisp 2-sentence response to whatever Jason had said before, I spent 5 to 10 minutes meandering through a response. So if you're now at this point, the reason what Jason just said, I just put that on. I just gave a prime example of what that looks like, of how it can be so mind-bending.
Well, and that's what's God's expectation in any of those 100,000 years ago, tomorrow, 100,000 years in the future, it is this notion, or it is this concept of trust me. And that feels not enough. There's not a lot of control in trusting God. I mean, the concept, I'm sitting here now, I'm making the control choice to trust you. But as soon as things don't go my way, which is a lot, then that's really, are you going to trust me now? Are you going to trust me now? Or trust me now? And that idea that he doesn't want us as independent operators. He wants us as dependent children on him, regardless of generation. And that's like coming to home base. You're out there and we're contemplating all these things, and then, okay, rest easy, because this is the height of his expectation. Trust me with this. And that's supposed to be that breath of fresh air,
Yeah, that's helpful. So when I get tongue tied and twisted into 1,000 different directions, and I'm like, how do you get there? How do you get there? And like maybe God's response would be, to quote David here, like, man, you can't ascend the mountain. You can't, like, you're trying to ascend the mountain. You're trying to stand in my place, and I'm just asking you to lift your head up. Feels like a pretty good end place.
I like it.
Thanks for listening to the Amazed and Perplexed podcast. We so appreciate anybody that would choose to listen to us. And if you've gotten to this point and you've listened to all of the words that we have to say, I would just humbly ask you if Amazed and Perplexed is something that blesses you, that you enjoy, that gets an occasional chuckle, or gives you a way to connect to God in a deeper way. Just humbly ask if you would consider sharing it with somebody else. People don't really advertise for podcasts. It just kind of happens by word of mouth. And so if this is something that helps you, maybe it would help somebody else in your life. And that would just be cool. Grace, peace, and love.